Welcome back. All right. I've talked about the race in the East. The race in the East is great, right? You've got Montreal's fought their way back into it. Detroit's in it. Ottawa's still in it. Boston's just above the playoff line. Columbus has actually passed them for that number one wild card spot. Some real surprises. Imagine if we see like Columbus and Montreal as the wild card teams in the East. Be crazy. Out west, things are a little less crazy. So right now, the one team above the playoff line on this board is Calgary. And I did a video on Calgary not long ago, and they lost both games against St. Louis. So if they'd won those two games in St. Louis, we'll just go down that rabbit hole. We'd be looking at a Blues team that if they were both regulation losses would have 44 points, and they'd be down here, and we'd be talking about it's probably not their year, but they have 48 points. They're only 1 point back. And so instead of Calgary, if they had won those two games, they'd have a 5 point cushion in this race for that final wild card spot, and they might be looking above themselves. Now they have to be concerned. So Calgary's got 44 games played, 21-16-7 record for 49 points. They're 5-5 in their last 10. One thing that stands out here too is that for those who believe that goal differential is a big indicator, none of the teams on the board have a positive goal differential. Calgary's is negative 14. Their upcoming schedule, they're in Winnipeg tomorrow. Then they come home, they play against Buffalo on Thursday. They're in Minnesota next Saturday. So they just have the 3 games over 8 days. Then they're in Winnipeg on Sunday the 26th. So from Minnesota to Winnipeg, that's going to be potentially tough right there. Then they come home, they play against Washington on Tuesday the 28th. And at home against Anaheim on Thursday the 30th of January. That rounds out their January schedule. Now, this past month, they've been 6-5-1. So, a little bit above 500, which compared to the teams beneath them here, it's pretty good. The only one that's gained anything on them is St. Louis. And over the last calendar month, they've only gained 1 point. So, there you go. 2.5 goals scored per game by Calgary during that time period. 2.67 goals against per game, which puts them ahead of Utah on this board, ahead of Vancouver, ahead of the Anaheim Ducks as well. The 2.67 goals against is the second best on the board after St. Louis. 16.7% on the power play, 67.7% on the penalty kill. That's a rough penalty kill number. Power play needs a little work too, but Calgary's up there. Now, Ryan Husk is the coach. I think he's pretty solid in his job. Craig Conroy's still the GM, and Calgary still has a lot they could do, really. So you have some pending UFAs. You have a team that's still looking at, retooling, not necessarily full-on rebuild. And so do you move those pending UFAs? Like Rasmus Anderson, they might get something really good for Rasmus Anderson if they put him out there. But we'll see what Calgary does at the deadline, and it may depend on what happens between now and the deadline. Because if Calgary drops down, then it's easier to sell the fans and the team on the idea of selling players off. But if they stay in this spot, it becomes a little bit more difficult to sell players. Maybe not the fans. I think the fans understand that this team's probably in need of some sort of a retool, and they're probably not, going to be world beaters just yet. But for players in that locker room, if they're above that playoff line, I don't think they're going to be all that happy if players get moved out in a selling procedure at the deadline. Now, Vancouver's fascinating. 44 games, 19, 15, and 10 record for 48 points. Over their last 10, 2, 5, and 3. They have been struggling. Their goal differential is now down to negative 15. And tomorrow night, they're at home against Edmonton. Now, in the back of my mind, I know how this works. They came off that embarrassing loss against Carolina, and then they had one of their best games of the season against Toronto. I would not be entirely surprised to see them win tomorrow night at home against Edmonton, across Canada, and who knows, maybe Winnipeg beats Calgary in regulation, Vancouver beats Edmonton. That way Vancouver jumps up above the playoff line, and then I do a power rankings and get told, how dare you not have them in the top 2 rows? So we'll see what happens there. Then Vancouver rounds out the homestand against Buffalo on Tuesday. And hey, Buffalo's been playing pretty well. Buffalo's been playing well enough that I think people would talk about it more if they didn't already have an awful record. And if they didn't, in the middle of all of that too, have some pretty rough games. Even when Buffalo's had some good wins, you can always pick out a loss. You go, yeah, but that one though. So after that, they go to Edmonton on Thursday. So Vancouver, 2 of their next 3s against Edmonton. Then they're at home against Washington on Saturday the 25th. And they go to St. Louis on Monday the 27th. After that, they're in Nashville on Wednesday the 29th and at Dallas on Friday the 31st. I would love to say, well, there's a few winnable games here if you look at, but with the way this team's played, they've lost some winnable games. They've won games people don't necessarily expect them to. Again, often enough to keep themselves here. But for the last month, they're 3-6-5, so they've only won 3 out of 14. This team's not playing well. 2.07 goals scored per game. I did just mention this in the comment section. I'll throw this out here as well. Rick Tocchet, when he was the coach in Arizona, each year it felt like they got a little more predictable to play against, a little bit easier to play against, and creativity was really down. And I do feel like with Vancouver that creativity has definitely fallen by the wayside. There's a lot of systems in place, and not all players thrive in that environment. And I do wonder if that's part of the reason why some of the offensive players are struggling to the tune of a 2.07 goals scored per game. But they're also allowing 3.43 goals against per game. So when you're playing in those systems and they work, your goals against should be staying down. You should at least be getting some goals in transition, right? On those turnovers. It's not happening. Their power play at 15.8%, considering who they can put out on the ice. That's not good enough. Their penalty kill, 81.6%. Again, the coach, Rick Tocchet. General manager, Patrick Allvin. I have faith in Allvin, but is it shaky right now? A little bit. But I wonder, is it a matter of the pieces that they're after are not available via trade? Or is this team still of the mind that things will just get better? And if they're of the mind things will just get better, give me their phone number, because I'll explain to them that's no. Then you got St. Louis, 46 games, so they've played more games than the two teams they're chasing here. 22-20-4 record for 48 points, but they are 6-4 in their last 10. Goal differentials, -4, which comparatively speaking to everybody else on the board is fantastic. Their coach, Jim Montgomery. And Jim Montgomery taking over as the coach, maybe we're starting to see the results. Now, tomorrow night they're in Utah. That's a big matchup for Utah. I think it's bigger for Utah than St. Louis. Because if Utah really truly wants to stay in the hunt, they need to win in regulation against St. Louis. They need to start fighting their way up. Then St. Louis is in Vegas on Monday, and then they're at home against Vegas on Thursday. So for anybody who believes that St. Louis is really going to, run towards a playoff spot, games against Vegas could be important, because that could be who you end up facing in the first round if you get in as the second wild card in the West. Then they're at home against Dallas on Saturday the 25th. So some tough games here. And then, as previously mentioned, they're at home against Vancouver on Monday the 27th before going to Denver and playing Colorado on Friday the 31st of January. So, interesting schedule upcoming. They do have direct contact with Utah and Vancouver where they can better their playoff hopes. Over this past month, they are 7-5-1, scoring 3.54 goals per game, allowing 2.54 goals against per game. Their power play, really solid, 23.3%. Their penalty kill, 66.7%. That's going to need to go up. But either way, St. Louis seems to be, maybe, that team that's going to grab that spot. Then we get to Utah. And from here down, I think it's less likely these teams rally, but you never know. Because in Utah's case, they're 6 points below the playoff line, but nobody's really running away with it right now. So if Utah can get hot. Now, in 44 games, they have a record of 18-19-7. They have 43 points. They're 2-7-1 in their last 10, a -12 goal differential. They're at home against St. Louis tomorrow, as previously mentioned. Then they're at home against Winnipeg on Monday. So divisional matchups. Then they go to Minnesota on Thursday, and they're at Winnipeg next Friday. So big 4 games coming up for them. They have Winnipeg twice. Utah's going to have to figure that out. Then they go to Ottawa on Sunday, the 26th. Then they come back home. They play against Pittsburgh on Wednesday, the 29th. And then they play at home against Columbus on Friday, the 31st. And we know how well Columbus is playing right now. So this upcoming schedule is going to give us a good idea for where this team's at. Now, their coach is still Andre Tourigny. I don't get the feeling Tourigny's job's in any kind of danger at all. I think that whatever happens, I think he'll probably at least stick around for the rest of this season. I don't see any change at GM. I didn't mention the GM here for St. Louis, and I should. Doug Armstrong. That Stanley Cup win in 2019 gives Armstrong a lot of leeway, right? It would definitely take a lot for St. Louis to say we're making a change at GM. And then Utah's got Bill Armstrong. That's why I thought, hey, I didn't mention Doug Armstrong. Should mention him first. Bill Armstrong's a good GM. I think Utah is a decent team. They've got a really good prospect pool. I think the fact that Josh Doan was down in the minors, they call him up. He looks completely at home in the call-up. And the fact he looked good for Arizona last year, too. It just shows the depth in this organization that a player that talented with that kind of future is allowed to mature in the minors before coming up to play in the NHL. So, yeah, it'll be interesting with Utah. They're 4-8-2 in their last in the last month. 2.29 goals scored per game. That's got to get better. There's a lot of talented players. Even with Dylan Guenther out, this is a talented team. They should be scoring more than that. 3.29 goals against per game, 23.1% on the power play, 90% on the penalty kill. Excellent penalty kill. It's just about getting that puck to go in the net a little bit more. 5-on-5. Because 23.1% on the power play tells me that's working. It's 5-on-5 where they're not getting it done. Anaheim, 45 games played, 18-21-6 record, 42 points. They're 4-4-2 in their last 10. Anaheim's been interesting. They have a negative 31 in goal differential. Yeah, that stands up. This is a team that when they lose big. But when they win, they're usually close games. And they do seem to be making a habit of challenging teams. So either it's a complete mess and they're nowhere near, or they're a challenge. They're not that easy to defeat. Now, tomorrow night, they're in Florida. As Detroit showed last night, Florida is having their struggles right now. And then Tuesday, they come home they're at home against Florida then on Tuesday. After that, they're at home against Pittsburgh on Thursday. They're at home against Nashville on Saturday the 25th. So after a very long road trip, they come home and play Florida, who they'll have just played in Florida. And then after that 3-game homestand there, they then go to Seattle on Tuesday the 28th. They're in Calgary on Thursday the 30th of January. So the rest of their schedule should make things very interesting for them, in that if they can even get the split against Florida, maybe they beat Pittsburgh, beat Nashville. Those are games that they could win. And then if you win in Seattle, maybe they can get on a bit of a run. There's just too many maybes, aren't there? Now, one thing that's interesting is, over the last month, they're 7-7-2. So they're not really falling off the pace. And if Anaheim added, like, getting Jacob Trouba is one thing. But if Pat Verbeek actually said, you know what? I think this team might be capable of a little bit more. They've scored 2.44 goals per game over the last month. They've allowed 3.19 goals against per game. So it is interesting they're 7-7-2, even though those numbers are not great. And their power play, what's that? 7% over the last month. Penalty kill, also not great at 72.9%. So special teams are doing Anaheim no favors right now. But Coach Greg Cronin has been pretty animated during the games where Anaheim doesn't look very good. He clearly does not approve of losing. Some coaches are very stoic and teams losing, and they don't seem to have any really big reaction to it. Cronin's not that. I don't know how he is at poker, but if that's his poker face, it's going to require some work. But Anaheim's one to keep an eye on, because we've still got a lot of hockey left to play. They do have cap space. And if Pat Verbeek decides, you know what, we're 7 points back, maybe. I'm not saying that he will, just if he did, could be entertaining. Then you got Seattle. Seattle might not have been expected to jump right back into the playoffs, but I think they were expected to be better than this. 19-24-3 record through 46 games for 41 points. And really, anything further out of the playoffs than that, I couldn't really justify having them on the board. Seattle's 4-5-1 in their last 10. They have a negative 15 in goal differential. They just shoot themselves in the foot. They don't have that consistency in game or from game to game, and it's kind of frustrating to watch. And I'm not even Kraken booster. I think that this team should be better than what they are. Now tomorrow night they're at home against LA, and by my recollection, they play pretty well against LA in general. Then they're at home against Buffalo on Monday. After that, they're at home against Washington before. That's on Thursday, and then they're at home against Pittsburgh on Saturday the 25th. So nice homestand here after kind of a challenging road trip, and we'll see if they can get things back together. Then they go to Edmonton on Monday the 27th of January. They're at home against Anaheim on Tuesday, so they go from Edmonton to home, which it's not an easy trip. I'm not sure why the NHL schedules it that way, like Edmonton's right next to Vancouver or Seattle. And then they're at home against San Jose on Thursday the 30th. And as San Jose's shown recently against Detroit, don't take them lightly or they'll beat you. Now, over the past month, Seattle 4-8-1. So that's the problem. The only team that they're keeping up with. You're looking at Utah and kind of Vancouver. Let's see. Vancouver 6, 11 points. No, they've lost 2 points on Vancouver too. So 2.85 goals scored per game, 3.69 goals against. Grubauer's numbers have not been fantastic. I do wonder if Grubauer's numbers keep trending the way they are. Does Grubauer stay in Seattle past the season? Do they look to make a move at some point? Their power play, 20.7%. Not bad. Penalty kill, 70.4%. Not great. So that's an issue. Their coach, of course, Dan Bilesma, it's his first year behind the bench with Seattle. I think he'll get the full season, and then they'll probably take a look at things. For Ron Francis, I think Ron Francis is a good general manager. But looking at what's going on with Seattle, in the back of my mind, I'm kind of remembering when he was in Carolina, and they had a good team, and they couldn't quite get in the playoffs, and then they made the change to Don Waddell, and things got better. I do wonder with Seattle, is Francis going to be around for the long haul? Would they look to make a change if this season, if we see this team fall further away from a playoff spot rather than getting closer to? It's important for Seattle, and it's important, I think, for Ron Francis's job security to see things get going in a better direction than what they have been. And I just say it's just pure speculation on my part, but coaches are hired to be fired, but GMs kind of are as well. They definitely get more time to figure things out than coaches do, but yeah, that's kind of where we're at right now. I think I heard a number that from the from the start of last season until now, there's been 19 different coaching changes. Just insane. But at any rate, let me know your thoughts in the comment section below. Which team's going to win this? I always use the term Turtle Derby, and that goes back to, I want to say it was 1990 or 1991, Winnipeg and Vancouver. Neither team seemed to want that last playoff spot, which made sense because if you made that last playoff spot, you got destroyed in the first round. So looking back now, I'm kind of like, you know what? I get it. But either way, let me know your thoughts. Who do you think ends up getting that last playoff spot in the West? Which team would you think could go on some kind of a run? And let's just say outside of Vancouver, which one are you most surprised by not having a better season than what we've seen so far? Let me know your thoughts. Hit like and subscribe if you haven't done so already. Thank you guys so much for all your support as always. I will talk to you again soon.